Welcome to my ranking of the Tarantino movies. I've been a big fan of his since way back in the 90s when there were only two of his films out. I can remember walking home from school with my friend and he was telling me about these great films, Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction. For some reason, I presumed that they were connected and my friend had to set me straight. He said, no, they're separate movies, nothing to do with each other, but they're by the same guy and they're both extremely cool. You've got to see them. So I took his advice. The rest is history, and I've pretty much seen every Quentin Tarantino film as soon as it's come out ever since. Now, a couple of things I've got to point out before we get into the ranking. Firstly, I'm only including his directorial efforts, so there's no True Romance, for example, which I believe he wrote. In fact, if you watch that film, it clearly feels like a Tarantino film, but I'm not putting that in here. And also, I'm only counting Kill Bill as one movie. It's pretty much one movie when you watch those films back to back. Runtime wise, I think it comes to about 3.5 hours if you do that. I think if both parts to Kill Bill had come in at about 5 hours, I might have said, no, that's too much. I've got to put them in as two separate entries. But no, on this particular ranking, there's just one entry for Kill Bill. And in the case of Death Proof, I'm only counting that as its own entry. I'm not including it as part of Grindhouse. Right, let's get into it and find out what is my ninth and therefore least favourite Quentin Tarantino movie. So straight away we have a little bit of an upset because I'm sure none of you expected this film to come bottom. It's not a bad film though. In fact, it's a very, very good one. This film now has the title, officially, of being the best film I have ever put bottom of a rankings on this channel. I can't remember what film previously held the title, but Reservoir Dogs is now king in that regard. When I saw this film, it was probably the first time in my life I'd ever seen a narrative that went back and forward with its timeline. I found that really inspirational, actually. I went away and planned a short story just because I was so inspired by this film. The story was called Turn Off Here. It was basically a rip-off of this. It was about gangsters fleeing a crime scene and escaping up a motorway. I didn't actually end up writing it, but what I did do was write down a synopsis of it, scene by scene, of how it was going to play out. I had a bit of fun with it. But in later years, I just don't think this is as good as Tarantino's later films. The dialogue is actually quite ropey when you go back and watch it now. There are still some really great scenes where the dialogue is awesome, especially in the scene where the lead gangster gives out the names, Mr. Orange, Mr. Yellow. Love that scene. But there are several other parts of the film where I just cringe now when I listen to some of the stuff that is coming out of these characters' mouths. It's just not as sharp as some of Tarantino's later work. So for that reason, and also the fact that this film just doesn't have the depth of the films to come, this one's bottom today. This one got a bit of a rough press when it came out. People said it wasn't as good as his first two, but, well, two things. Firstly, he couldn't carry on making movies about gangsters driving along in cars, firing off wisecracks, and then moving the scenes in and out of order. He had to do something different at some point. And secondly, I don't think this film was even his story. I think he adapted it from a novel, and I'm guessing it was quite a faithful adaptation because it's a really straight down the line crime story. There's this great character played by Samuel L. Jackson and he dies in the most anticlimactic way you can imagine. So I'm not convinced Tarantino did much tampering to the original story at all. Just put a few touches on the thing here and there. There is a big discrepancy in this film between how much I enjoy watching the bad characters and how much I do not enjoy watching the good characters because they are so bland. But the story is very rewatchable because I can never quite remember what happens in this. It's something to do with double crossing and money in bags and money laundering and stuff and smuggling money in planes. I could not tell you the plot off the top of my head right now, even though I've seen the movie about 4 times. So this is a very good film. I will at least put it above Reservoir Dogs, but there are way better on this list today. We're already into the films that I absolutely love, and we're only at number 7. Death Proof is just friggin' awesome. It has an amazing soundtrack. One of the best movie villains ever in Stuntman Mike, played by Kurt Russell. So many quotable lines. It's just such a fun movie to chill out with this. I watched it quite recently. I saw it at the cinema when it came out. We could only watch it as one singular film in the UK. We didn't get the Grindhouse release. I've still to this day Never seen Planet Terror. You'd have to tell me if that film grouped with Death Proof is a satisfying experience. I don't know. The one weak point in Death Proof is possibly its ending. It's a little bit cheesy, but for the most part, I really, really enjoy this. It's really good. I didn't immediately watch part one of this when it first came out because I didn't want to get to the end and be frustrated by the fact that I couldn't watch part two for another 6 or 7 months. That turned out to be a good decision because when part two was showing in cinemas, that's when I finally bought the DVD, as it would have been at the time, of part one. I took it round to a friend's house and there were about four of us watching this film for the first time. We all thought it was so awesome that we immediately, as soon as the credits had finished rolling, we all decided to just go to the cinema that same night and watch part two. When we did that, though, I don't think any of us really thought part two was anywhere near as good as the first one. It just wasn't what we were expecting. Now, in later years, I've sort of reappraised part two, and I do think it's better now, but you absolutely have to watch the two films back to back, I think, to enjoy part two. Part two doesn't really work in isolation for me, and the one or two times where I've watched part one on its own and intended to go back to part two later on that week, for example, I've never done so. You have to watch both films together or you just won't end up watching part two. That's my experience anyway, but just for the House of the Burning Leaves section alone, I absolutely love Kill Bill. It's quite a unique, albeit very, very long film. Perhaps this is another surprise that this one is quite low, but I think this film is suffering today on this particular ranking just because I've seen it so many times over the past 25 years or so. I probably have seen this film at least 10 times, I reckon. And there are a lot of other films in the ranking today which I've just seen far less. If I was told to go away next week and watch a bunch of Tarantino films, this would be probably one of the ones I would want to watch last just because I've seen it so many times. But I mean, as a movie, it's faultless. 2.5 hours that just whistles by. The storyline is a little bit here and there and all over the place, but it doesn't matter because the script is so good. I said earlier that Reservoir Dogs was maybe not the best of Tarantino's script, but there's nothing about the dialogue in the second film that I would sharpen up. I think by the time he got to his second movie, Tarantino had literally become the full package by that point, and he knew exactly what he was doing. The soundtrack in this film is great. The casting is great. It's such a fun movie, very iconic as well. There's just no criticism of a lot of these movies that I can give today. If I try and get into the minds of people watching this right now, I reckon people are thinking, The Hateful Eight above Pulp Fiction, but I generally prefer westerns to gangster films. I think that has influenced my thinking here. The Hateful Eight is possibly Tarantino's best script, if not necessarily his best movie. I mean, this is almost 3 hours long. There's not an awful lot of action in it, but it is so entertaining, so absorbing. Most of the film takes place in this one oversized shack. There are some outdoor scenes early on, some great cinematography in this sort of snowy western setting, but most of the film is just a dialogue between these characters. You're constantly looking at all the faces of these people, trying to get clues as to who's secretly a bad guy, who's got something to hide maybe. It's a really, really fascinating film. The dialogue is so varied as well. There's funny parts of the film, there's some really vicious parts of the film. Things do not play out in the way that you expect them to. It's a completely impossible film to predict, I think. I think the film is massively underrated. I don't know if it's just too much of an effort for people to sit through this because it's so long and you have to be in a certain mood for it, but there's so many great performances. Samuel L. Jackson's speech about Mexicans and dogs is just absolutely legendary. You've got Kurt Russell and Jennifer Jason Leigh and Walton Goggins and just this massive list of incredible talent. Tim Roth. Love this film. It's really, really good stuff. This film started out at about sixth when I was first writing these films down on paper, but The more I've been heading towards filming this video, I've gradually nudged it higher and higher, and now it's third. Again, I think it comes down to genre for me. I do prefer war films to gangster films, which is why, again, this film would come above Pulp Fiction. My dad was never into this, even though he liked war films. He just didn't like the Tarantino style. I think he got as far in this as when Brad Pitt and his gang first scalped one of the Germans, and then he just had to turn it off. But I've always really enjoyed this film. For me, it has two aces up its sleeve, which really make it great. The first is the hangman character. I forget who plays that part. He's like this really cocky German guy who's incredibly well spoken. He always seems to be in control. He can speak about 4 languages. He gets some great scenes, and he's not overused, which is crucial. And also, there's this segment of the film where Michael Fassbender comes into it as a spy, and he ends up down in this cellar of a German bar, and he's trying to maintain his cover, but he's finding it really difficult. And the dialogue in that scene is just so spot on perfect. It's funny, it's engrossing. The end of the scene is really tragic, but it's just absolutely amazing. So I'm very content that Inglourious Bastards should be number 3 on the list today. So here we have the second of Tarantino's westerns. I like the fact that he set one of them up north in snowy Wyoming and the other one in the much hotter south, somewhere like Georgia. I forget the exact state that was used for this film, but I can still remember when I went to watch this. It was a Saturday afternoon. I had such a good time. The comedy's great. The action's great. Samuel L. Jackson steals the show again, playing this black guy who's racist towards other black people. It's ingenious. And DiCaprio plays a really good villain as well. He's got this ranch called Candyland. He says this amazing line. It's something like, "Gentlemen, you had my curiosity. Now you have my attention." Love that. And Tarantino himself turns up in this film as this really thick yokel who gets blown up by dynamite within about a minute of coming off on screen. Just a brilliant, brilliant film. And it almost made number 1. I really had to think between these top 2, but ultimately I decided to go for this one instead as my number 1. Yep, Tarantino's most recent film is currently my favourite. It's cool, actually, getting to do a ranking where the most recent film is the best. It is very rare that that happens. Usually when I'm doing a rankings, the original film is very high, and then at the bottom of the list, you'll have like the lazy sequels that maybe came further down the line sort of thing. But I guess it helps that on today's ranking, these are all films which are not connected to each other. When I first saw this, I was a little bit taken aback by the climax. It wasn't what I was expecting. I think like a lot of people, I was expecting to see the whole Sharon Tate murder situation. And there is a sense of foreboding throughout the film that you are going to see that. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, you know what, I get what he was going for now, and this whole film is just a delight from start to finish. If you spent a lot of your life watching movies and TV shows, then to watch even a jokey interpretation of the innermost workings of Hollywood is a real pleasure. Visually, this film is absolutely stunning. Performances are really great, especially from Brad Pitt. And this film could yet actually get even better, because I've read a few weeks ago that they're going to bring out an extended cut of this with like 20 minutes extra or something like that. But the film as it stands is really, really terrific. It is my number 1. Do let me know what your favourites are, what your list would be. That was my Quentin Tarantino ranking. I will see you all again next time.